The estate was a gilded cage, ruled by a man who measured loyalty in silence and fear. For the new employee, one rule was absolute: never encroach upon the boss's family. But when the protected daughter began to shake with fever and unimaginable terror, the young woman made a fatal calculation. She offered comfort, crossing the ultimate line of intimacy and defiance. She slept beside the vulnerable child in a momentary, forbidden truce. The peace lasted until the door swung open. The architect of chaos stood there silent, his gaze landing on the unforgivable scene. Now her survival depends entirely on whether he sees an act of profound, selfless solace or a lethal threat against his bloodline. The silence of the Ironwood Manor was never an absence of sound, but rather the highly pressurized presence of impending judgment. It was a cold, opulent vault built of Italian marble and terrible power, where every footfall, every whispered directive, was absorbed by thick velvet carpets and high vaulted ceilings, only to be echoed internally by the constant dread of those who served within its walls. Here, within the rigidly controlled ecosystem, lived Clara Jennings, 24, a woman whose lean build and perpetually watchful light brown eyes belied a fierce humanitarian core buried deep beneath layers of rehearsed caution. She had been rigorously screened and accepted during the hiring and initiation, her role defined as a peripheral observer, a utility, invisible unless summoned. Her quarters, located in the servants' annex, were functional and confined, a clean but comfortless space that geographically and socially emphasized her dangerous periphery status to the main house. Clara understood the rules inherently. She was hired to serve the structure, not the people within it. Personal connection was the fastest route to obliteration. The architect of this terrifying order was Sterling Blackwood, 52, the infamous head of the East Coast Syndicate. His imposing physique was matched only by the unnerving calm reflected in his silver-streaked dark hair and sharp, expressionless grey eyes. He was absolute control distilled into human form, a man who moved without shadow and spoke without inflection, yet whose very presence vibrated with implied, limitless menace. Clara moved through the mansion's lower levels in the oppressive quiet of the late afternoon, the pressure building as the weather outside worsened. It was the tempestuous night, a date that would eventually etch itself into her memory as the moment her practiced self-preservation failed, superseded by something far more fundamental. Outside, the rain did not fall. It attacked the windows, and the wind screamed like something feral trapped in the perimeter trees. Dinner service had been executed with the usual monastic silence. Mr. Blackwood was away on business, a fact that usually offered a minuscule, temporary relief to the staff, though the silence in his absence often felt louder, a vacuum waiting to be violently filled. The only other permanent resident of the mansion's private sphere was his daughter. Lydia Blackwood, 11, lived in a state of profound, arrested fear. She possessed a slight frame, often hunched shoulders, and wide, perpetually nervous blue eyes that rarely met anyone else's gaze. Lydia was the most precious and vulnerable asset in the entire compound, yet she suffered from a severe, almost debilitating isolation that was the cruel byproduct of her father's protective cage. She was a ghost in the vast, cold house, protected by walls, guards, and wealth, yet profoundly exposed to the existential terror of her own existence. Around 11 o'clock, the storm peaked. Clara was attempting to read in the sterile quiet of the annex when a sound, thin and strained, pierced the heavy walls of the main house. It wasn't a cry for help. It was too weak for that. It was the sound of uncontrollable physical distress, a ragged, choked gasp followed by a tremor against the silence. Clara's heart seized. She thought of the rules, of the swift, irreparable consequences. She saw the faces of the guards, the implicit threat in every highly polished surface. But then she heard the sound again, a desperate, watery choke. It was Willow's panic attack, and it was happening now. She moved, not running, but gliding with the disciplined silence learned from months of observation. Up the back stairs, past the silent security cameras she knew by heart, through the shadows that clung to the velvet-thick air. Lydia's door was ajar, surprisingly. The room was immense, luxurious yet felt suffocating. In the center stood the four-poster canopy bed, a dark, heavy sanctuary meant to protect her, but which seemed only to amplify her solitude. Lydia was tangled in the expensive sheets, her small body convulsing. She was shivering violently, her skin pale, slick with cold sweat and a high fever. Her eyes were wide, not focusing on Clara, but fixed on some invisible horror in the shadows. She was past crying, locked in a physiological feedback loop of terror and delirium. Clara crossed the threshold, the silence in the room heavy enough to crush her. Every fiber of her rational, self-preserving mind screamed at her to retreat, to find a vetted member of the medical staff, or better yet, to press the small unseen silent alarm button placed discreetly beside Lydia's mahogany nightstand, a button designed to summon Blackwood's private security detail instantly. Clara looked at the child, then at the button. The security detail would stabilize the physical condition, but they would treat the terror like a malfunction, like a dangerous breach of decorum. They would sedate her and report the deviation. They would never provide the simplest, most human need, comfort. The choice, brutal and immediate, was made. Clara ignored the button. She dismissed all caution, all training, all fear of Sterling Blackwood. Humanity won. She knelt by the bed, speaking in the quietest voice, a steady, low murmur. "Lydia, it's Clara. I'm here. You're all right. It's just the storm." The girl didn't recognize her. She only shook harder, muttering incoherent fears about shadows that tasted like iron and cold hands. The fever was spiking. Her small hands were icy. Clara knew this wasn't about a physical ailment alone. This was the terror of the compound made manifest. The isolation had become lethal. She gently peeled back the damp sheets. The small body trembled uncontrollably. Clara hesitated for only a fraction of a second, but that second felt like an eternity, marking the true moment of transgression. The ultimate rule of the Thorn compound was to never, under any circumstance, encroach on the personal space of the boss's family, particularly not in the profound intimacy of the bedroom. Clara slipped off her shoes and scaled the steps to the four-poster canopy bed. She lay down beside the shaking girl. The warmth of her body, the simple, undeniable presence of another breathing, non-threatening human being, was immediate medicine. Clara pulled the thin, trembling shoulders against her chest, wrapping her arms around the frail frame. She did not speak again, simply held her, letting the rhythm of her own breathing and the steady beat of her heart counteract the girl's panic. Slowly, agonizingly, the violent shivers subsided. The fever persisted, but the profound, uncontrolled panic began to recede. Lydia whimpered once, a small childlike sound that had been absent in her terror, and burrowed into Clara's side. The forbidden truce had been achieved. In the heart of the crime lord's fortress, Clara had traded her life for this singular moment of peace. The exhaustion of the day, the relentless tension of living under Blackwood's regime, and the draining emotional intensity of the last hour now hit Clara with the force of the storm outside. She remained entirely still, careful not to disturb the girl who had finally found a fragile, temporary refuge from her inner demons. Lydia's breathing smoothed out, deep and even. She was asleep. Clara stayed awake for a long time, listening to the heavy rain drumming a funeral march against the massive windows, staring up at the dark canopy. She knew what she had done. It was an action that could only be explained by the deep moral and humanitarian impulses that defied her cautious exterior. She had chosen connection over survival. She did not intend to fall asleep. She intended to stay until the child was stable, then silently slip away back to the annex, praying the fever would drop before morning and that the night's events would remain her dangerous secret. But the warmth of the bed, the heavy security of the room, and the immense release of tension after the crisis conspired against her vigilance. Her eyes grew heavy, the soft, rhythmic puff of Lydia's breath against her neck, acting as a potent sedative. The last rational thought that surfaced was the chilling awareness that she was profoundly exposed, asleep beside the vulnerable, protected daughter of the most dangerous man she had ever known. Clara finally succumbed to a deep, dreamless sleep, wrapped around the Blackwood air. The storm outside had momentarily paused, leaving a strange, echoing silence in its wake, broken only by the steady drip of water from the eaves. The Ironwood Manor had an almost supernatural quality of alerting its inhabitants to the arrival of its master, even before his car had passed through the outer gates. Sterling Blackwood did not simply arrive, he manifested. Sterling Blackwood had returned unexpectedly early. His meeting had been concluded with ruthless efficiency, and the unsettling silence of his home office in the city felt tiresome. He preferred the deep, pervasive quiet of the manor where his control was absolute. He entered the master suite hallway, his custom-made shoes making no sound whatsoever on the thick velvet carpet. He was an imposing shadow in his perfectly tailored suit, his face unreadable. Two security personnel stationed near the wing stiffened, recognizing the unique gravity of his approach, but they did not move or speak. They knew better than to acknowledge him unless acknowledged first. Blackwood intended to check on Lydia before retiring. It was a ritualistic act of confirmation, confirming her safety, confirming his control over his world. He reached the threshold of her room. The door, which should have been fully closed, was slightly ajar. His grey eyes narrowed imperceptibly. A small deviation, an abnormality. He pushed the door inward, using just the tips of his fingers. The room was bathed in the faint, silvery light, filtering through the canopy and the remnants of the night. Sterling Blackwood paused, an immense, immovable pillar of judgment silhouetted in the doorway. He did not move, did not breathe, did not make a single sound. He took in the scene, the expansive, darkened room, the four-poster canopy bed, and the two figures nestled within it. Lydia was soundly asleep, her head tucked securely under the chin of the employee, the hired help, the background noise. Clara Jennings was deeply unconscious, her face resting lightly on the expensive pillow, her arm draped protectively across Lydia's back. She was not in a servant's posture, she was in a mother's posture, an act of profound, instinctive intimacy. The image was a lethal violation of every rule Blackwood had established for the compound's integrity. It was a boundary crossed that no one in his world would dare breach, a transgression that demanded immediate, violent reprisal. His assets were untouchable. His daughter was sacred territory. And yet here was an observer, an outsider, having seized that most intimate space. Blackwood's mind did not race. It froze, assessing the threat level with surgical precision. Was this an insidious attempt at leverage? A slow play for trust intended to expose a weakness? Was this a hired asset, perhaps planted by a rival faction, capitalizing on his daughter's vulnerability? If so, the required response was swift, silent, and permanent eradication. He took 2 silent steps into the room, his eyes fixed on Clara's face, searching for any flicker of awareness, any sign of deceit. Her expression, however, was one of simple, exhausted peace. He moved closer to the bed, the immense weight of his presence filling the air, a physical force that should have woken Clara immediately. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The silence surrounding the Thorns' silent arrival was absolute. A void waiting to swallow the infraction whole. He stood over them a few feet from the bed, gazing down upon what she'd done. Lydia stirred slightly, tightening her grip on Clara's simple cotton shirt. She made a sound of contentment, not fear. Sterling Blackwood watched this tiny interaction. The tightening of a small hand, the relaxed, fever-flushed face of his daughter, finally sleeping without the aid of chemical intervention. He saw the way Clara's body was curved protectively around Lydia's, minimizing the exposure to the room. It was not a gesture of dominance or manipulation. It was a pure mammalian comfort. He reached out a large hand, stopping just short of touching either of them. His gaze lingered on Lydia's face, which for the first time in memory was smoothed free of perpetual anxiety. He knew the terror that haunted her nights. The doctors had called it acute situational trauma, a product of living in the shadow of his work. No amount of money or security had ever been able to buy her this specific, unguarded tranquility. The truth of the scene began to filter through the hard shell of his ruthlessness. A mercenary would never risk such a deep exposure. An enemy operative would utilize fear, not soothe it. What he witnessed was an act of profound, selfless comfort, devoid of agenda. The realization did not soften him, but it complicated the protocol. Clara Jennings had broken the law of the house, yet the result of her transgression was the one thing he could not procure: genuine, unadulterated safety for his child. He stood there for a full 5 minutes, a lifetime in the high-stakes world of the manor, processing the conflict between his instinct to eliminate the breach and the evidence that the breach had healed his asset. He noticed the sheen of sweat on Lydia's forehead. He saw the discarded soaked sheets nearby, indicating the severity of the fever and the panic. He saw the untouched silent alarm button on the nightstand. Clara had not sought protocol. She had sought solution. With the slightest flex of his jaw, Blackwood made his decision. He did not touch them. Instead, he turned and moved toward the room's thermostat, lowering the temperature by 2 degrees to help counter the lingering fever. He adjusted the curtains slightly, blocking the pale morning light that would soon arrive. He was an architect of chaos, but also a parent desperate to protect his lineage. He returned to the bedside, his expression still a mask of granite, but his grey eyes held a new, dangerous complexity. He did not wake Clara. Waking her would necessitate the execution of the rule. He would not allow himself to articulate the threat, because the threat was inextricably linked to the success of her action. He watched them for another minute, the air thick with unspoken consequence. Then, with the fluid silence that defined his movements, Sterling Blackwood turned and exited the room, pulling the heavy door almost fully shut behind him. He walked past the security personnel, who maintained rigid, expressionless poses. They were trained not to notice, not to hear, not to question. He went directly to his own suite, pulled out his secure phone, and made a single, low-voiced call to his head of staff, Mr. Denton. The staff rotation for the Eastern Wing, effective immediately. Miss Jennings is to be assigned to the second-floor primary staff quarters. Her duties are strictly housekeeping, non-rotational. She will not step foot in the private residential wing or the annex, for any reason, starting sunrise. And Denton. Blackwood's voice dropped to a barely audible rasp, carrying a warning that vibrated across the secure line. If you or anyone ever mention her proximity to the child tonight, or if you attempt to discuss the nature of her new assignment, consider yourself terminated, permanently. He disconnected the call before Denton could acknowledge. Clara Jennings' life had been spared by the sheer undeniable efficacy of her compassion. She had not been punished for the breach, but she had been exiled from the proximity that allowed the breach to occur. The judgment was swift, silent, and absolute. She would live, but she would never again be close enough to matter. Her punishment was not death, but the chilling realization that her life was now entirely contingent on her remaining peripheral, and that her single greatest act of humanity had earned her permanent distant surveillance. As the first bruised light of dawn filtered over the Ironwood Manor, Clara Jennings woke abruptly, the immediate sickening realization of where she was flooding her senses. She felt the heavy silence, the warmth of the child against her, and the absence of the storm. She eased herself away from Lydia, who remained in a deep, peaceful sleep. Clara looked around the room, expecting the guards, the condemnation, the armed men. There was nothing. No sign of intrusion, no immediate threat. She slipped out of the bed, her body trembling now, not from fear of the child, but from the sudden, profound terror of the reckoning that must surely follow. She smoothed the sheets where she had lain, a useless, ritualistic gesture of correction. She glanced at the door, then back at Lydia. The girl was stable, resting soundly. Clara moved to the threshold, her gaze catching on something near the doorframe, a single minute droplet of water on the thick velvet carpet, a remnant of a recent wet shoe, not hers. She froze. Sterling Blackwood had not only returned, but he had stood there. He had seen her. She understood immediately that the silence was not luck. It was a temporary, chilling reprieve. She did not know why she was still breathing, but she knew with cold certainty that her fate had already been decided in that agonizing, silent moment of observation. She slipped out of the room, retracing her steps down the long, silent hallway, arriving back in the servants' annex just as the first alarm sounded for the start of the day shift. Denton was waiting for her, his face pale and strained, his eyes wide with a fear that reflected Blackwood's silent warning. "Jennings," Denton whispered, barely moving his lips, "you are assigned to the second-floor staff quarters. Primary service. You will move your things immediately. Do not speak of your previous assignment. Do not speak of last night." He emphasized the word never with a look of desperate finality. Clara understood. Her act of compassion had been seen, registered, and filed away. She was alive, an anomaly in Blackwood's logic, a living testament to the possibility of unintended positive consequence in his brutal world. She walked away from the annex, exiled to the upper floors, forever carrying the knowledge that the most ruthless man in the city knew exactly what her moral threshold was, and had chosen, for the sake of his sleeping daughter, to let her live with it. The fragile, forbidden peace had come at the cost of her remaining freedom within the manor. She would continue to serve, perpetually watched, permanently isolated, a quiet prisoner of her own selfless decision. The frigid morning air of the Ironwood Manor was no cleaner than the night before, merely less agitated. Clara moved through the transition, the reality of her survival settling like a sheet of ice over her humanitarian triumph. Denton's desperate whispers had been the seal on her new sentence. She was not dead, but she was profoundly, chillingly exposed. She packed her few belongings from the servants' annex, a sparse collection that spoke of temporary habitation and the absence of any true personal life, in less than 5 minutes. Denton hovered nearby, a nervous phantom, physically unable to make eye contact with the woman who had somehow inexplicably survived the boss's direct line of sight after committing an unpardonable sin. The other staff in the annex watched from the corners of their eyes, their expressions a mixture of horror and confused reverence. Clara was now the living legend, the idiot who broke the rule and lived, yet her survival carried the palpable stench of imminent doom. Her new quarters on the second floor were identical to the annex room in size, but located geographically opposite the main private wing. It felt like being placed in a pressure lock. The room overlooked the northern edge of the compound, a perpetual view of dense black cypress trees and the high concrete wall that separated the world from Sterling's control. It was further from Lydia, further from the center of power, and therefore further from the quick, clean ending Clara knew she deserved. Her new duty was defined by relentless, mechanical monotony. She was to manage the general upkeep of the second floors, long impersonal corridors and the guest suites, rooms that were rarely used and offered no opportunity for meaningful interaction. It was housekeeping stripped of all observational latitude. She was visible, busy, and monitored. Every sweep of the broom, every fold of a towel, was performed under the theoretical, though perhaps real, eye of Blackwood's pervasive surveillance system. Her role had shifted from quiet periphery to exposed exile. She began her first shift that same morning, hours after her heart-stopping escape. The weight of exhaustion was immense, but she dared not slow down. Speed and flawless execution were her only defenses now. She polished the ornate door handles, each rotation a meditation on her precarious existence. The true terror lay not in the execution of the work, but in the overwhelming silence of her new normal. Before, the silence of the manor had been the sound of fear contained. Now it was the sound of expectation. Sterling had not acted, and in this world, an unexecuted judgment was infinitely more frightening than a swift one. Clara kept replaying the image of the wet shoe mark, the minute water droplet on the velvet carpet outside Lydia's room. He had been there. He had watched her sleep beside his child. He had walked away. The calculation behind that choice was a terrifying void she could not comprehend. It violated everything she knew about his reputation, about the brutal, uncompromising efficiency of his regime. She tried to rationalize it through Lydia. The girl had been genuinely peaceful. Perhaps Sterling, in that single moment, valued the tangible result of comfort over the abstract demand for protocol. But this rationalization felt flimsy, based on the assumption that Sterling possessed a shred of parental sentimentality that contradicted his entire terrifying persona. Meanwhile, in the private wing, Sterling was awake. He was in his private study, a room lined with dark, non-reflective wood and heavy security monitors, disguised within historical maps. He stood looking out over the manicured lawn, the lingering chill of the storm mirroring the temperature he preferred for his operating environment. Sterling Blackwood did not sleep soundly, even on the rare nights he was home. He functioned on precision and calculated risk. The events of the tempestuous night had introduced a variable, Clara, that was entirely unpredictable, and now occupied a disproportionate amount of his mental bandwidth. He hadn't spared her out of mercy. Mercy was a liability. He had spared her because she had solved a problem that money, threat, and medical intervention could not touch. Lydia's fragile mental state was the compound's greatest security flaw. Her isolation, born from extreme protection, fueled her night terrors. These episodes represented moments of instability, moments when she was most vulnerable to external manipulation or internal collapse. Sterling needed his daughter to be stable, both for his own dark definition of paternal duty and for the systemic integrity of his lineage. But Sterling had seen the undeniable proof of the act. He had felt the heavy silence of the room, the strange, magnetic pull of the unexpected peace. She is a potential weakness. An exposure point, his internal security protocol screamed, eliminate the breach. But the image persisted. Lydia's face, smooth and placid, sleeping without the clenched terror that usually defined her slumber. Sterling sat at his desk, the wood cool beneath his fingertips. He considered the cost of her action. It was a breach of trust, an act of insubordination that should have been dealt with by a bullet. The cost of her elimination was zero. The cost of her survival, however, was high. It meant introducing an unprecedented anomaly into his perfectly ordered system. It meant acknowledging that a human element, pure, unadulterated, and terrifyingly selfless care, could override his best security measures. He realized then that Clara was not a threat to his physical structure. She was a threat to his ideology. She represented a compassion that had no place in his world, yet had proven effective. His grey eyes narrowed, reflecting the cold light of the morning. He had exiled her, placed her where she could not interact with Lydia, where she could be watched constantly without the security detail feeling directly involved. He had neutralized the proximity threat, but he had not fired her. He had not killed her. Why keep her? The pragmatic answer was brutally simple. As long as she lived within his walls, she was a known quantity, a weapon accidentally deployed that proved useful. If Lydia's panic returned, and if all other means failed, Clara represented the last resort, a controlled solution, deployed under extreme duress. The thought revolted him. Sterling Blackwood did not rely on sentiment. He relied on iron. Yet he had made the calculated choice to preserve the possibility of accessing that unique, forbidden compassion again, if necessary. He was a man who built his empire on the elimination of variables, and now he was protecting a dangerous variable, a humanitarian impulse, because it benefited his bloodline. This self-contradiction was the true measure of his desperation to protect his daughter. The climax of the night was not the moment he stood over the bed, but the moment he walked away, the moment he consciously chose to circumvent his own unyielding law. "I want the surveillance feed on the second floor, specifically the eastern wing. Enhanced," he commanded, his voice flat. "Prioritize Miss Jennings' movements, not just real-time. I want a historical database of her demeanor, her nonverbals. I want to know when she blinks. I want to know when she breathes a sigh of relief. And I want to know when she harbors resentment." His instruction was absolute. Turn her life into data. She was to be monitored until her internal psychological pattern yielded a definitive weakness he could exploit, or until her loyalty fractured beyond repair. Her survival was conditional, monitored down to the micro-expression. Back on the second floor, Clara finished dusting a rarely used mahogany table. She felt the scrutiny, the invisible weight of the cameras, the cold precision of the man who now owned her life, not through employment, but through a terrifying, tacit agreement of conditional survival. She tried to locate resentment, but found none. Only a deep, numbing exhaustion and the unwavering belief that she had made the only moral choice possible. That choice was her true sanctuary. She knew she would never see Lydia again. That distance was the physical manifestation of her punishment. It was a unique form of incarceration, the freedom to move within the compound, but the absolute loss of connection to the one person who had required her help. Days bled into weeks. Clara maintained a flawless routine. Her efficiency was mechanical, almost robotic. She cleaned the same hallways, the same sterile rooms, adhering to Denton's nervous demands with unnerving perfection. She became a ghost of the second floor, seen, acknowledged in passing, but never engaged. The staff treated her like a symbol of dangerous transgression, someone too close to the fire to touch. The constant surveillance was a psychological siege. Every sigh, every prolonged pause, every flicker of emotion was being recorded, logged, and analyzed by professionals tasked with finding the flaw in her composure. Clara countered this by maintaining a disciplined neutrality. Her mind was active, observational, but her body was a perfect canvas of professional subservience. One afternoon, weeks later, Clara was replacing linens in an unused guest room when she heard a familiar but rare sound, the light, tentative footsteps of a child on the main staircase below, followed by the heavy, deliberate tread of Sterling's expensive shoes. Clara froze, her hands mid-fold. She was close enough to the main hall to hear clearly, but the strict geographic separation meant she was out of sight. She heard Lydia's voice, a soft, higher pitch than she remembered, almost hesitant. "Father, is it true?" Sterling's reply was a low, resonant murmur, devoid of comfort, yet undeniably present. "What, Lydia?" That the person who helped me with the fever, they left the manor? Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a violent reminder of her exposed position. Sterling must have concocted a story. That she was dismissed or simply moved. She strained to hear his reply, bracing herself for the lie that would finalize her excision from Lydia's memory. Sterling paused. The silence was thick, filled only by the muffled echo of his presence. "No," he finally said, his voice flat, emotionless. "She is still here, serving." Lydia's voice brightened, a tiny spark of relief cutting through the air. "Oh, good." Then Sterling added a single, chilling clarification, one that confirmed his entire calculation. "But she is where she belongs, Lydia, in service to the structure. You are protected." The footsteps continued, moving away from the second floor towards the sunroom. Clara leaned against the wall, absorbing the shock of his honesty. He hadn't lied to his daughter, not precisely. He had simply redefined the boundaries. Clara was serving the structure, and her utility was purely logistical. He had kept her visible, a strange, distant assurance for Lydia, while ensuring the psychological distance remained absolute. The revelation brought no relief, only a sharpened edge to her terror. She was not only a prisoner, she was a prop. Her life was a calculated piece of the manor's internal security theater. She finished her task, her movements slowing slightly as she processed this ultimate act of cold control. Sterling Blackwood had not been fooled by her compassion. He had categorized it, neutralized its intimacy, and harnessed its effect. The humanitarian impulse that saved Lydia had sealed Clara's fate within the manor walls. She was safe, provided she never attempted to communicate, never tried to recross the line he had drawn in that silent, terrifying moment of judgment. She would live perpetually on the periphery, a quiet testament to the fact that even in a world ruled by pure brutality, the unintended consequence of kindness could force a tyrant to rewrite his own rules, but only for the most brutal of reasons. Clara placed the stack of fresh linens precisely in the cabinet, shut the door, and walked back out into the long, empty hall, the quiet prisoner of the Ironwood Manor, forever carrying the knowledge that she was alive because her enemy needed the possibility of her virtue. The terror was permanent, the surveillance absolute, and the peace she had found was now solely for the benefit of others. There was no escape. Her moral courage had merely bought her a life sentence of isolated service. She closed the door on the unused room, her footsteps echoing softly on the thick carpet, perfectly in rhythm with the unforgiving order of the house. The silence enveloped her once more, and she knew she would spend the rest of her days under the watchful, expressionless grey eyes of the man who had spared her life, only to control her soul. The psychological siege intensified with every flawlessly polished surface. Clara moved through the endless corridors of the second floor, her internal world a screaming tempest, locked behind an expressionless mask. She was the ideal employee, silent, efficient, and utterly devoid of personal life or ambition. But her perfection was a weapon wielded against her own soul, a necessity born from the chilling knowledge that Sterling was not waiting for her to fail at her duties. He was waiting for her to fail at being human. The surveillance wasn't limited to the hidden cameras. Denton, the nervous, perpetually sweating head of staff, often appeared in the eastern wing under contrived pretenses, his presence an extension of Sterling's watchful eyes. He would check the inventory of unused toiletries, comment on the angle of the curtains, or simply stand by the staircase, creating a palpable layer of scrutiny. Clara met his anxious gaze with unwavering neutrality, offering only short, professional acknowledgements. She understood that every interaction, no matter how brief, was an opportunity for her composure to fracture. Days stretched into a monotonous blur. The Ironwood Manor, particularly the unused northern wing, was a mausoleum of quiet wealth. The air was perpetually dry and cool, smelling faintly of expensive dust and lemon polish. Clara spent hours managing the guest suites, spaces designed for temporary habitation, yet imbued with a paralyzing sense of permanence. She often imagined what kind of visitors Sterling hosted in these rooms, what deals were sealed within the thick walls. The thought provided a brief, detached respite from focusing on her own confinement. She focused on the physicality of the work, the rhythmic sweeping, the exact symmetry of pillow placement. These rituals were her armor. She treated her body not as an instrument of feeling, but as a machine programmed for compliance. She had to eliminate the humanitarian Clara, who had climbed into that bed, replacing her with the serviceable shell Sterling had chosen to spare. Yet sometimes, the old Clara broke through. It happened in the quiet moments, usually when she was gazing out of the northern windows, across the expanse of black cypress trees, towards the distant, unforgiving wall. She would remember the weight of Lydia's small, shivering body against hers, the fragile trust in the child's breathing, when the terror finally receded. That memory was a profound comfort and her most dangerous liability. It was proof that connection, even momentary, was possible in this sterile fortress, and it fueled a dangerous hidden hope that Sterling was trying to starve out of her. Meanwhile, Sterling was growing impatient. In his private study, the cold glow of the monitors reflected in his sharp grey eyes. He received the daily psychometric reports on Clara, compiled by his security analysis team, led by a clinical, efficient operative named Finch. "Any significant deviations, Finch?" Sterling asked, his voice low, a controlled rumble. Finch, projected onto the screen via a secure line from an off-site location, adjusted her glasses. "Negative, Mr. Blackwood. We are logging sub-5-degree changes in her facial temperature regulation. Her blink rate remains perfectly stable, slightly below the average for sustained focus, suggesting high internal control. No recorded sighs of relief, no excessive micro-expressions of resentment or distress. She is, for lack of a better term, geometrically consistent." Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, the sound barely audible. "Geometrically consistent. She's too perfect. Sir, the data suggests she is either deeply repressed or entirely complacent with her current assignment," Finch continued, her tone clinical. "We have noted 0 attempts to breach protocol, 0 prolonged glances towards the main wing, and absolute adherence to the geographic boundary. She is a model prisoner, a model with a conscience," Sterling corrected, a muscle ticking in his jaw. The lack of data was, in itself, terrifying. Most people, under this level of surveillance and psychological pressure, cracked. They developed nervous tics, exhibited anger, or showed fear. Clara showed nothing. She had eliminated her internal landscape, becoming an empty slate that surveillance couldn't read. This unnerved Sterling more than any open act of rebellion. He preferred overt threats. A known weakness was easily managed. An absence of weakness suggested an internal mechanism he couldn't grasp, a moral fortitude that operated outside the currency of fear and profit that governed his world. Sterling had been confident that the psychological isolation would either drive her to desperate measures, justifying her immediate elimination, or crush her into a useful, compliant servant stripped of all dangerous impulse, but she had simply become harder. He terminated the call and stared at the live feed of the eastern corridor. Clara was there, pushing a cart of cleaning supplies. She paused, adjusting a small bottle of glass cleaner on the lower shelf, a precise, unnecessary movement. He watched her for 5 minutes, waiting for the slightest evidence of human fatigue. There was none. He was caught in an impasse. He had neutralized the threat of her proximity, yet she remained a volatile element simply by existing, a living reminder that his system was flawed. If Lydia's needs ever resurfaced, if his daughter's terror returned, he would be forced to deploy the Clara variable again, a variable he did not trust, but one that had proven uniquely effective. The cost of keeping her alive, the systemic risk, was mounting, but the necessity of Lydia's stability superseded all else. Sterling felt a familiar, cold weariness. His entire life was dedicated to controlling chaos, and this single small act of compassion by a minimum-wage employee had become a chaos factor he couldn't eliminate without inviting instability back into his daughter's life. He needed Lydia to be well, and the knowledge that the girl remembered the comfort Clara provided meant that Clara was now inextricably linked to that elusive sense of peace. He decided on a subtle escalation. If her demeanor was unbreakable, he would test her environment. He would introduce a controlled disruption, something that required a moral decision but stayed within the confines of her duties. The next afternoon, the disruption arrived. Clara was cleaning the grand gallery, a long marble-floored hall on the second floor that connected the guest wing to the main staircase. It was an area technically under her jurisdiction, but usually handled by a rotating staff. Today, she was alone. As she reached the midpoint of the gallery, her mop bucket rattling softly, she saw it. A small antique music box had been deliberately placed on the edge of a narrow pedestal, precariously close to the polished floor. The pedestal was historically significant, part of Sterling's private collection, and the music box looked fragile, made of dark enamel and delicate filigree. Clara paused, her internal security protocols screaming. This was not normal. Nothing in this house was ever left out of place. It was a test. If she ignored it, she was negligent. If she moved it, she was breaching the boundary of simple cleaning to handle high-value property, a direct violation of her initial hiring rules, which strictly forbade touching personal items of value without direct instruction. She glanced up, searching for a surveillance camera. She knew there were several hidden in the ceiling coving, focused directly on this artifact. Sterling was watching. The music box looked like something Lydia might own, something small and cherished, perhaps dropped accidentally, but the precision of its placement, right on the edge, daring gravity, suggested malice, not accident. Clara took a slow, deliberate breath. This was the moment of decision, the moral impetus versus the absolute protocol. If she allowed it to fall and shatter, she could claim ignorance or adherence to the non-touch rule. But the loss of a priceless antique would still be held against her. If she secured it, she would prove she was willing to disregard rules for the sake of preserving property, which could be interpreted as arrogance or opportunism. She approached the pedestal slowly. Her light brown eyes scanned the details of the box. It wasn't Lydia's. It was too ornate, too adult. It was bait. Clara made a decision that was characteristically moral but tactically insane. She would secure the item, but she would do it in a way that demonstrated maximum professional distance and minimum personal investment. She pulled a clean, thin white cloth from her cart, the kind used for polishing fine wood, and carefully draped it over her hand. She did not touch the music box with her bare skin. She gently lifted the small box, her movement slow and measured, ensuring the security camera could register every millimeter of the transfer. She didn't move it far. She simply shifted it 3 inches back from the perilous edge of the pedestal, placing it firmly in the center. She then removed her hand, placing the cloth back on her cart. She continued mopping the marble floor, her movements perfectly resuming their mechanical rhythm. She had secured the item, demonstrating care, but she had not moved it to a safer location, which would be too far outside her brief, and she had handled it with clinical neutrality. In his study, Sterling watched the feed, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. She neutralized the variable, he murmured to the empty room. No panic, no avarice, just rigid, immediate correction of a preventable error. Finch, still on standby, spoke up immediately. Her reaction time was 2.3 seconds from observation to action. 0 hesitation. She seems incapable of making an emotionally driven mistake, sir. Sterling dismissed the analysis. She was calculating her survival, not acting out of moral duty, he decided. But the result was the same, compliance, delivered through an uncomfortable demonstration of control. He was testing her limits, and she was responding by showing him she had none. The test confirmed that Clara was not greedy and not easily panicked, but it did not confirm she was loyal, nor did it break her silence. The siege continued. Weeks turned into a season. The oppressive quiet of the manor deepened as winter approached, drawing the walls closer. Clara's routine never wavered. She existed in a state of hyper-vigilance, her soul slowly being calcified by the cold reality of her incarceration. She knew that Sterling was using her presence to soothe Lydia, but the knowledge brought no solace, only a deeper sense of dread. She was a living ghost, occasionally mentioned to mollify a child, but forbidden from true interaction. Then, one late afternoon, while Clara was in the final stage of cleaning the furthest guest room in the eastern wing, a room designated for emergency security overflow, rarely used, she heard the sound. It wasn't Sterling's heavy tread or Denton's hurried shuffle. It was a light, uneven padding on the thick hall carpet drawing closer. Clara froze, her heart seizing. Her logical mind told her that no one, especially not Lydia, was allowed unsupervised in this section of the second floor. This area was a buffer zone. The footsteps stopped directly outside the room. Clara was trapped. She was holding a linen basket, her back to the door. Clara didn't move. She couldn't. Reacting was a breach. Ignoring it felt like a betrayal. Another, slightly more insistent tap. Then the soft, reedy voice of Lydia muffled by the heavy door. "Clara, are you in there?" The sound of her name, spoken in that small, hopeful tone, was a physical blow. It was the sound of the boundary being violently shattered, not by Clara's action, but by the gravitational pull of Lydia's need. Sterling's security system was designed to repel external threats, but it had failed to contain the internal one, the child's loneliness. Clara slowly placed the linen basket on the floor, the woven material sighing as it settled. She turned towards the door. She was acutely aware that the security feed would have flagged Lydia's movement the moment she crossed the private wing threshold. Sterling knew. He was already moving. The silence in the house, usually a sign of perfect order, was now the sound of a predator closing in. Clara walked to the door, her breath shallow. She hesitated for a crucial second, her hand hovering over the cold brass knob. She had been instructed to remain physically separate. To open the door was the ultimate insubordination, directly inviting the very interaction Sterling had risked his system to prevent. But Lydia was waiting, and the memory of the trembling, feverish girl overrode the terror of the consequences. Clara opened the door. Lydia stood in the carpeted hallway, tiny in a pale blue dress that looked too formal for an impromptu visit. Her nervous blue eyes were wide, and her shoulders were slightly hunched, but there was a flicker of determination in her gaze that Clara had never witnessed before. "Lydia," Clara whispered, "the name of forbidden prayer. They told me you were just cleaning," Lydia said quickly, her words tumbling out. "But I haven't seen you downstairs, and Father said you were here, serving." She looked around the cold, impersonal hallway, confirming her isolation. "I am, Lydia." "I clean the second floor," Clara confirmed, keeping her voice low and steady. Lydia took a small step forward, invading the physical space Clara had been mandated to maintain. I wanted to say thank you," Lydia said, looking down at the plush carpet. "For that night, when I was so afraid. It was the first time I didn't feel alone, and the fever went away. The genuine, unadulterated gratitude was staggering. It wasn't a trick. It was a pure, emotional dividend of Clara's reckless compassion." Clara bent slightly, trying to minimize the physical imposition while still acknowledging the child. "You are welcome, Lydia. You are safe here." "I know," Lydia said, but her voice faltered. "But sometimes, being safe feels the most lonely." She raised her head, and her eyes pleaded with Clara. "I just needed to see you were real, that you were okay." This moment, the desperate seeking of reassurance, was the true breach. It proved that Sterling's attempt to harness Clara's kindness while neutralizing her intimacy had failed. The connection was established, and now Lydia was willing to risk Sterling's wrath to maintain it. Clara's internal control wavered. She wanted to offer comfort, to speak a word of kindness that wasn't professional and sterile, but she couldn't. Sterling was minutes, perhaps seconds, away. "Lydia, you need to go back to your wing," Clara urged gently but firmly. "No, wait," Lydia insisted, her small hand reaching out and grasping Clara's apron, a light, desperate clutch. "I wanted to ask you something." Before she could speak, the atmosphere of the hallway shifted violently. It wasn't a noise, but a pressure, the sudden, tangible weight of a formidable presence. The air grew heavy and cold, sucking the remaining sound out of the vast space. Clara's head snapped up. Down the long, velvet-carpeted hallway, at the juncture where the gallery met the main staircase, a figure stood. Sterling. He was silent, a study in lethal stillness. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit, and his silver-streaked hair caught the dim afternoon light. His grey eyes were fixed, not on Clara but on the connection, Lydia's hand clutching Clara's apron. The sight was infinitely more damning than the first night. The first time Clara was providing care for a crisis she stumbled upon. This time she had opened the door. She had permitted the intrusion, knowingly violating the geographic exile he had imposed. Sterling didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply began to walk the length of the hallway toward them, his expensive shoes making no sound on the thick pile carpet. Each step was a calculated measure of judgment, closing the distance between control and chaos. Lydia, sensing the shift in atmosphere before seeing her father, turned. The moment her eyes met Sterling's, the determination drained out of her face, replaced by profound, crippling terror. She released Clara's apron, shrinking back against the doorframe. Clara stood her ground, placing her body slightly in front of Lydia, a silent, reflexive act of protection. She knew this was the end. Her survival had been a temporary, utilitarian reprieve. Now she had proven her moral impulse was stronger than her self-preservation, making her too dangerous to contain. Sterling reached them. He stopped 3 feet away, imposing and terrifying. He looked down at his daughter, his face impassive. "Lydia," he said, the name delivered like a verdict. Lydia was paralyzed, trembling severely now, just as she had been during the fever. The brief peace she had sought was violently replaced by the fear she lived in every day. The confrontation had backfired completely. Clara's action to provide comfort had only succeeded in escalating Lydia's anxiety. Sterling's gaze shifted from Lydia to Clara. The grey eyes were glaciers of accusation, colder than the winter air outside. He had spared her because she was useful in restoring peace. Now she was the catalyst for panic. "You defied the single rule of your continued employment," Sterling stated, his voice devoid of volume, yet crushing in its intensity. "You engaged my daughter in a restricted area." Clara did not look away. She held his gaze, refusing to apologize, refusing to submit to the lie that she regretted the human impulse. "She was afraid, sir," Clara stated simply. "She came here seeking reassurance." "Reassurance you are forbidden to provide," Sterling countered. "The logic absolute. Your proximity is a systemic instability, Jennings." He turned back to Lydia, who was now weeping silently, her entire body shaking. "Go to your room, Lydia." Now, Lydia didn't hesitate. She fled down the hallway, a small blue blur of fear, running back towards the private wing, leaving Clara alone to face the consequences. The silence returned, heavier and more lethal than before. Sterling stood over Clara, the distance now negligible. "Tell me why I should not terminate your employment permanently right now," he demanded. Clara swallowed, her throat dry. She had no defense based on protocol or self-interest, only the truth. "Because she needs to know that the human connection she experienced that night was real," Clara said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "She lives in constant fear, Sterling. You have protected her from every threat outside these walls, but you haven't protected her from the fear you created inside them. I am not a threat to her. I am simply a person who showed her kindness. Keeping me alive, even under surveillance, was your own acknowledgement of that necessity." Sterling's expression remained frozen, unreadable. Clara was effectively telling the Mafia boss that his entire paternal strategy was flawed, and that her forbidden compassion was a necessary corrective. He took another step closer, forcing Clara to lift her chin to meet his height. She could smell the faint, clean scent of his expensive cologne. "I am aware of my strategy, Jennings, and I do not tolerate insubordination," Sterling replied. "You have demonstrated that you prioritize a humanitarian impulse over the contract we tacitly established. That makes you unreliable, and in my structure, unreliability is death." The climax had arrived. Clara's life, which had been spared by a single act of mercy, was now to be revoked by a second conscious act of connection. Clara closed her eyes briefly, accepting the conclusion. "If you kill me, Sterling," Clara said, opening her eyes, her gaze locked fiercely with his, "you will prove her fear correct. You will prove that every connection made in this house is punished, and the next time she is terrified, she will be utterly, completely alone." Sterling stood silent for a long moment, the man wrestling with the crime lord. He was faced with the ultimate contradiction. Eliminating the threat Clara meant causing systemic damage, Lydia's return to terror. Allowing the threat to live meant permanently destabilizing his control. His gaze dropped slightly, focusing not on her eyes, but on her flawless, unmoving stance. She was ready to die, but she was not broken. Slowly, Sterling reached out. Clara flinched, expecting a strike, a weapon. Instead, Sterling's large hand went past her shoulder and gripped the brass door handle of the guest room. He pushed the door open completely, revealing the sterile, unused space. "You are no longer assigned to the second-floor corridors," Sterling commanded, his voice returning to its normal flat baritone. "You are a variable I cannot trust to function on the periphery." Clara watched, confused. "You will report to the private wing staff quarters. Effective immediately. You will be placed within the immediate sphere of Lydia's protection detail." The change was shocking. He wasn't banishing her further. He was dragging her into the center of the danger. "You will be monitored by 3 full-time personnel, Jennings. Every breath, every movement, every shift in your schedule will be logged and analyzed in real time. You will be physically closer to my daughter than any staff member, but you will not speak to her. You will not acknowledge her presence, and you will not, under any circumstances, Respond to her unless I personally issue the command. His eyes narrowed to slits. You wanted to prove your importance to her stability. Fine. You are now the centerpiece of her security structure. You will be a silent, living sentinel, an example of perfect, agonizing obedience. He paused, letting the severity of the new sentence sink in. If you break this proximity protocol, if you speak to her, touch her, or engage her in any way without my direct order, the consequence will not be termination of employment. It will be the termination of your existence, and it will be immediate. You will suffer no lingering uncertainty. Clara realized the terrifying precision of his decision. He had not bowed to her moral pressure. He had internalized it, refined it, and used it to redefine her captivity. He was placing her where Lydia could see her, know she was real and safe, but where Clara herself would live under the most extreme, constant, and inescapable threat. She was now a known quantity, deployed directly under his sight, her utility maximized by her proximity, and her lethal threat controlled by absolute scrutiny. Do you understand your new role, Jennings? Yes, Sterling, Clara replied, the words a bitter admission of her total subjugation. Go collect your belongings. You will be escorted to the private wing staff quarters within the hour. Do not deviate from the pre-approved path. Sterling turned, dismissing her with the absolute finality of a dictator. He walked back down the hallway, his steps as silent and authoritative as before, leaving Clara standing alone in the quiet aftermath of the storm. Clara slowly moved to retrieve her linen basket. She was not safe. She was less safe than before, but she was not exiled. Her moral choice had bought her not freedom, but a far more intense and dangerous proximity to the source of both her terror and her only meaningful connection within the Ironwood Manor. She had fought for human connection, and she had won a life sentence standing beside the child, yet forbidden to speak. She was the permanent silent guardian, a living monument to the fact that even the most ruthless control system had to bend to the necessity of kindness, provided that kindness could be held in an iron fist. Her survival was conditional, terrifying, and now inextricably woven into the fabric of Sterling's private, lethal world. She walked towards her new fate, the shadow of Sterling's judgment permanently affixed to her heels. The silence of the manor felt like the sound of her own heartbeat, perfectly regulated, constantly monitored and fully controlled. Her service had just begun. Smash that like, then subscribe to level up your feed.